Peter, for joining us here, and it must be evening for you, correct?
It is. It is about 7 p.m. here where I am. I'm in Kalispell, Montana at the moment, not in my usual base of San Francisco.
Great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate everyone. Welcome to this session, Analyzing Climate Change During COVID-19 or Pandemic. So this session is part of the Data and Computational Journalism Conference in Indonesia 2022, which is the first leading data journalism conference, which delivers best practices of data journalism, explore new emerging technologies, showcases story, and exchange knowledge between experts from the US, like Peter, we have here, Indonesia, Australia, Sweden, England, Nepal, and many more. This conference is fully funded by the US Embassy in Jakarta, Indonesia. So this session, Peter, BuzzFeed News Science reporter, will talk about how the newsroom works and approach science writing, and more importantly, regarding the climate crisis during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I will read through a short bio of Peter, but before that, I will let the audience know that you can listening this session in Indonesia. There is an interpretation button on the right sidebar of your Zoom, so you can have a look at it now. And then if you click that, there will be options to listen in Indonesia. Then you will be listening in Indonesian. But if you fancy listening in English, so don't bother. Okay, there should be also a question and answer sessions in the end of the panel. Please feel free to drop any questions, not until the 30 minutes, last 30 minutes, but you can drop questions anytime you want, but we will read through and also answer your questions later on. Okay, Peter is a science and data reporter based in San Francisco. He got his break in journalism in 1989 as a reporter for Nature in London, fresh from a PhD in animal behavior. Sounds interesting, Peter.
Less interesting in practice, perhaps, but
yeah. And as European correspondent for Science, news editor for New Scientist, and chief news and features editor with Nature before moving back to California in 2005 to become New Science San Francisco bureau chief. And from 2015 to 2022, he worked on the science desk at BuzzFeed News, which I am assuming now you are currently signing off from the newspaper, from the publication.
That's correct. Yeah, I'll mention that.
Okay, and he covers a variety of topics, including the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate change, of course. And Peter also teaches investigative and policy reporting and data visualization in the Science Communication Program at University of California, Santa Cruz, and data visualization in the Graduate School of Journalism at the University of California, Berkeley. And he runs his training in data analysis and visualization for the Berkeley Advanced Media Institute. Wow, such a profile, Peter. And we are really happy to have you here. So, Peter, we would love to hear your presentation. You may start now, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you first for the invite. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you, and very glad to hear that this is the first conference of this type in your part of the world, and also glad that the US government is supporting that. That's very encouraging. So I'm going to try and share my screen and show you my slides. So can you perhaps just let me know, are you now seeing
Perfect. Yep.
A map of, well, I'll talk about that map in a minute, but I'm going to first try and rearrange my screen a little, get to my slides. So we should now be looking at the title of this talk, which is, as I was requested, Analysing Climate Change During COVID. So thanks for the introduction. I don't need to say much more about myself, but therefore, if anybody is interested in contacting me later on, those are my main coordinates, Twitter, email, and my GitHub account, where you'll find some of the projects I'm going to be talking about. And I want to start with this. This is a cartoon that was published in the very early stages of the pandemic by a Canadian cartoonist. And for me, it really encapsulates the problem that we faced on what is a pretty small science desk. So BuzzFeed News science desk had at that time just 4 reporters and 1 editor. And the pandemic pretty much meant we had to drop everything we were doing, and we became almost totally consumed by coverage of the pandemic. For me in particular, the data side, tracking various COVID data. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But in our mind, it was always that this cartoon is, well, this crisis, it is a crisis, it is overwhelming, it is going to dominate our reporting lives. But we knew the bigger crisis of climate change is not going away. And this cartoon, I think, exemplifies that pretty well. And now, of course, we seem to have just been in complete crisis mode ever since, because now that cartoon, if you drew it now, would have the war in Ukraine, it would have the supply chain crisis, it would have food supply crises, and an even bigger recession possibly looming on the horizon. So this was the situation we were in. And I want to talk a little bit about how we kept coverage of what we felt, and when I say we, I mean 2 of us in particular, the whole science desk, but particularly my colleague Zara Aghnia, who was BuzzFeed News' main climate reporter, and me, who collaborated with her very often, usually providing the data component of these stories. So as I thought about what we did and how we did manage to keep climate data coverage going, I came up with these 4 bullet points. First one, which we did very early on, was covering the effect of pandemic lockdowns, and not just lockdowns, but the wider sort of economic effects of the pandemic on carbon emissions. We did that pretty early, and I'll talk about a story in a minute. But the COVID pandemic, it did build skills, resources, templates that we were then able to use. So I mentioned already that my life became almost completely subsumed with keeping our various trackers of the COVID pandemic doing. So we've got programs, R scripts. I work in the R programming language, running in the cloud, processing data, updating data, making charts. And then also we built templates that we use for these trackers. And there was a very conscious effort on my part to say, okay, we have this infrastructure now, let's use it for climate coverage as well. So I'll talk about how we built a climate tracker and also I did a wildfire tracker as well, which obviously is climate related. Another thing that proved very useful is just before the pandemic, Zara and I took over a BuzzFeed Twitter account called BuzzFeed Storm. Now, as the name suggests, it mostly handled extreme weather coverage, but you know, our agenda with it as well was very much to anchor that in climate, because a lot of these extreme weather events are driven by climate change. And actually, I certainly found that, you know, spending an hour or so each day, just sort of managing that account, tweeting, keeping on top of the news on what's going on in extreme weather and climate, really not only gave us a presence for a fairly low investment, but it also fed into the last data point, which is we could see from that opportunities for enterprise data reporting, which sometimes we were able to jump on at various points in the pandemic when there was a bit of a lull. So if you put all of that together, I think that's kind of why we were still doing climate coverage, even though kind of we didn't have time, but we did it anyway. Okay, so let's consider the first one. So this is a story we did. You can see the date on it is May 2020. So we're only a few months into the global pandemic, which was declared, if I remember, in March 2020. And this, we wanted to look at what was happening with emissions because we knew they were going down. We wanted to put this in context, and the headline really here says it all. You know, it has reduced emissions, it's not enough. And we did this from data from the International Energy Agency. So that's a UN agency. And this was the initial chart in that story, which just kind of shows you a couple of things. It's really two charts. The top chart is a simple line chart showing annual carbon dioxide emissions in billion metric tons. So you'll see it's mostly a very prolonged rise. So we need to be reducing emissions, but they're actually increasing. But with this little dip at the end, which was IEA's projection for 2020 based on what they had already seen in the first couple of months of the pandemic. And then the bottom chart is on a different scale, but it's a column chart that just shows the annual change in each year. And then I've annotated it with previous events. So COVID-19 obviously is causing the biggest annual reduction, but there are other events that affected the global economy or energy markets that caused previous reductions that I annotated onto the chart as well. Now, okay, clearly crashing your economy and locking everybody down is not the way to deal with climate change. I mean, this was really the point of the story, and we really made the point that as we try and spend our way out of the oncoming recession, if you remember that initial cartoon that I showed you, there is an opportunity to invest in new energy systems and various other green technologies and reduce emissions. Sadly, not an opportunity that has really been fully taken, but the opportunity was there. And to illustrate this, I then turned that chart into an animation, which we see here. And the slightly transparent line and columns shows what would be needed, a projection looking forward to meet the Paris target for global warming of keeping it below 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. And coincidentally, it turns out that the year-on-year decline that was needed was almost exactly the same as the reduction that IEA was projecting for 2020. So it leads you to this very smooth curve. We are not on that curve, and there is a lot still to be done. Okay, so I talked about COVID data tracking, and I think in many ways, COVID was the sort of proof of concept, I think, for sort of live data tracking, data journalism, and has been a big success in media in the past couple of years. This I'm showing you here is the main BuzzFeed News COVID tracker. We also had a vaccine tracker going on and various other related pieces. Just showing the first chart in here. But you can see we've developed a style for this. We're doing it on this gray background. we like to put in these big, bold numbers at the front, which are total cases and deaths. And there's a whole series of charts, both for the US and the entire globe, in that piece. I should, at this point, I'm going to call up the chat, and I am going to, drop into the chat before I forget links to all of these stories I'm going to be talking about and a few other resources. So hopefully I can do that. Yeah, you should see there. If people want to follow these links, you should be able to do it. So let me return to my presentation, hopefully. You're hopefully seeing that again now. Okay, yes?
Well, 1 minute. I think we need the host to share it to everyone, because I don't have the authority to share to the chat. Thank you.
Sorry, what is the... I've shared to the chat already, but you are seeing my screen again, yes?
Correct, yeah.
Great, super. So
Thank
I'll
you.
carry on. Yeah, so this one, and I will attempt to follow out and show you this story in more detail. You can see it uses exactly the same format. The charts are all done with data wrapper. The numbers in the charts are updated with various R scripts again, which I have running in the cloud, or I had running in the cloud. These ones are actually manually updated because we do them less frequently. The COVID ones were automatically updating. But again, you see the same format. So I'm just going to drop out of that and hope that you are still seeing. Are you now seeing a browser window with that story?
Yep, perfect.
Great. Okay, you see that Zara is my collaborator on this story. So here for our big numbers, we've used the amount of warming average globally over pre-industrial levels and the amount of sea level rise. And then we go into a series of charts. So we have monthly temperature relative to the 1951-80 average from 2 sources. We have, now this map I'm going to show you later. This was actually made for an earlier story, but reused and redesigned a little bit for this story. But it's quite a nice little interactive in that you can click anywhere on the chart, anywhere on the map, and you will get a temperature time series for that location in the world. And I'll talk about how that was done later on, because it sort of introduces the concept of gridded climate data and some nice stuff you can do with Mapbox, okay? So then we also looked at sea level. We looked at atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, both in the modern era and in, I guess, geological history over 800,000 years. There's the modern era at the end with this massive, unprecedented increase. And then we looked at emissions by country. We looked at global emissions by continent, and it's a different data source, but you can see that the sort of top of that area chart is very similar to that line chart I showed you in the first story, because it's essentially the same trend. And finally, we published this during the meeting that happened in Glasgow in November 21. This was the big meeting to update pledges to try and meet this Paris commitment. And we put in a chart during the meeting that shows a number of things. So the black line is, actual recorded emissions. And then, well, this is what we need to do to get to the Paris goal. That's very similar to that projection I showed you previously. That's where the world was at during that meeting, and that was where emissions would go and the temperature we would end up with from the pledges and targets that were announced around that meeting. So let me just get back into my full screen slideshow and move on. So I mentioned that a sort of aid to just keeping us on top of the thing was the fact that we were managing the relevant social media accounts at BuzzFeed News at the time. And here it is, BuzzFeed Storm. Sadly, it hasn't tweeted since early July when I left BuzzFeed News. Just a quick aside on that, BuzzFeed News has rather shrunk its newsroom in the past few months. Many of us have taken voluntary redundancy, and unfortunately the whole of the science desk is no more, which is I'm very sad about, but we did great work, I hope people think, and that legacy will last. Okay, so you can see that this account is tweeting about extreme weather, including typhoons. As that animation scrolls past, that map, show the one moved past fairly quickly, showing a tropical storm passing across Central America, is one of the many things that I actually kind of made with more updating scripts to track extreme weather, particularly for tweeting from BuzzFeed Storm, but we also ran stories from it. And as I said, that Twitter account, keeping us really on the ball of what was happening with extreme weather and climate change, did give us some opportunities for enterprise data reporting. And the biggest one I want to talk about happened, well, there was an event that happened in February 2021, and the story ran in May 2021. And this is when a really extreme winter storm hit Texas, but not only Texas, many other states in the southern United States in particular. But what was different in Texas is its power grid largely collapsed. So it had been warned that the state needed to winterize its power infrastructure. The state hadn't done that. So this was very much an accountability story. And sadly, over Valentine's Day weekend, when this happened, many people were dying. And I knew, given what I knew about the recording of cause of death in the United States, it's not that good. And in Texas in particular, it's even worse. I was pretty sure they wouldn't account for the full death toll. Now, this again has a COVID link, because what I realized I could do was inspired by other people's COVID reporting. So one of the things we've seen with data reporting in the COVID era is the use of excess death statistical analysis to, in countries and not just countries, within countries, in places that weren't fully counting all of the deaths from COVID. That has been the case in many countries. You can use this approach to estimate how many people the disease actually killed. And I realized I could use the same statistical methods to predict how many people should have died in each US state in each week, and show that there was a big spike in Texas for which the only explanation was the loss of power in this extreme cold. And coincidentally, this happened as this is a chart from our COVID tracker at BuzzFeed News. But so the event was here in February. And you can see that COVID is reducing from the biggest peak that had happened at that time. And by the time the story appeared in May, we were at a bit of a lull. So we did actually have some space to do some other reporting, which this needed. And this is the story that ran, that says it all. The Texas winter storm and power outages killed hundreds more people than the state says. At that time, Texas was saying that 151 people had died. I think the official count is now up to 246. My statistical analysis, and we followed through and we found people and families and interviewed them who'd lost loved ones to reinforce that what we were saying was true. Our analysis is that the true number is likely rather more than 700, not 151. That then led, having done that and shown how powerful that could be, I started thinking more about deaths from extreme weather and climate change. I think one of the big challenges in journalism now is how do we really make people care? And for me, there's no more reason to care than it's killing people, and it's killing people now. I started to look more into not the numbers on deaths from extreme weather. And I found that you would think, the United States, massive economy, developed country, should have very good statistics on that. Not so. I found major discrepancies between different data sources, including, for example, the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Storm Events Database. I looked at an international database as well. Now, there were kind of big differences. And this is particularly true for things like cold snaps and heat waves. Now, heat waves, huge concern. We're seeing them this year. And there was a big one in the Pacific Northwest United States last year. So for part of this story that we published right at the end of last year, December 2021, I did some excess deaths analysis again for the heat wave in the Pacific Northwest, and again showed that the death toll had been significantly underestimated in the official counts. So
Peter,
that is
sorry. Apologize. I think you have 3 minutes left to run through the live demo.
So I will try and zoom through the next bit. So sorry, excuse me, choking there. That is my summary of kind of how we handled the climate data challenge during COVID. But I do want to talk a little bit about, if you want to do climate data reporting, a particular type of data that you're probably going to need to know about. So we're all familiar with spreadsheets, databases, and so on. But climate and weather data is kind of often unusual. It's often stored in data sets that have a latitude and a longitude grid with data for each cell in the grid. But there is often a third dimension, and the third dimension is time. So I'll show some graphical representations of this, and it'll become a bit more obvious what I mean. Most commonly, this data is available in a file format called netcdf, which if you're not a climate reporter, you may not be familiar with. So here is an example. This is that NASA data that is used for the map I showed you, the one where you can click on and get the temperature change over the years. It's called the GIST temp analysis, and that is the data I use there, and it's a netcdf file. Just to make the point that this is more general, this is the main climate data guide offered by the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. Most of the data sets it has available for linking to and download are available as netcdf files. So this will probably give you a bit better idea of how that works. So here's a plot of a map of the world, just latitude against longitude, nothing more sophisticated. And on top of that, there's a grid superimposed. And a netcdf file will have data on temperature, precipitation, whatever it is, for each cell in that grid. But also, there will be a grid or an array for each time period. And for that NASA data, it's every month since 1880. So
apologize,
if you want,
Peter. I think I need to cut your session, and then
okay.
Yeah, apologize for that. But we can always discuss this in the question and answer session. We already have questions here from Adzkia. I think the first one was not a question. So Adzkia.
So shall I switch off my sharing?
Yes, please. So we can have your video.
Yeah.
So would you say that you see a deteriorating trend in climate crisis in the pandemic, supposedly because everyone is focused on COVID?
I think more to the point, what I'm worried about is the effect of the current economic crisis triggered by the war in Ukraine, actually, in terms of where we're going with the climate crisis. I think the pandemic did kind of create opportunities. I said those opportunities were not taken necessarily, but I think there was a realization that, okay, we can get out of this situation we're in with COVID and develop our economy and try and do that in a way that will address climate change. There was a willingness to do that in some parts of the political spectrum. It hasn't happened to the extent that I would have hoped to have seen. But what I'm more worried about is, given the squeeze on energy in particular in the current crisis driven by what's going on in Ukraine, I think that is encouraging a lot more short-termism in thinking, and I think it's going to get pretty difficult to do the sorts of things we need to do on climate change when everybody is worried about the cost of petroleum. I just think it's very, very hard. So I'm somewhat worried at this point, I must admit.
Yeah, thank you. I think your answer just resonates. The first point you shown us about the carbon dioxide, what is it, like waste from company, that is so related to the economy crisis as well. That's interesting presentation as well. And I have another questions, which I think very relates to Indonesian audience and context. In this country, people are buying stories like crime or justice. How do we sort of like relate these climate change issues and take this into justice reporting headline?
Yeah, well, I think it is. I think there's very, very strong links. I feel very strongly that we need to get climate reporting out of it being part of environment reporting or part of science reporting. Okay, that's where I come from. But as the last couple of stories I talked about showed, this affects people, and people die as a result of what is going on, or not, and people's livelihoods are ruined by the effects of climate change and extreme weather. And we certainly know in the United States that who is affected most by that? It's the poor, it's racial minorities, it's, the people who already have the hardest time in society are being disproportionately hit by the effects of climate change. And that is playing out internationally as well. Some of the poorest nations in the world are experiencing the worst effects. And I mean, it goes back a while, but I did actually do some reporting from Indonesia way back. I think in 2004, I did reporting on draining of peat swamps and deforestation and burning of the dried out peat in Kalimantan. It was a really eye-opening experience to me. It was something that clearly arose out of a political situation, because there was this thing called the Mega Rice Project, which was a big initiative of the then Suharto government. We're going back a period in time, but again, it's really striking that, you know, a lot of people got rich out of that, the people at the top, and a lot of people suffered from that, the people at the bottom. So I think in almost all of these stories, there is a very strong social and environmental justice angle to be written about, and it's vital that we do that.
Yeah, interesting. Deforestation has been always a very interesting topic for reporters, even in the country, to run through and to work on as well. So you mentioned about the number of people died because of the extreme weather in the US. And I saw the gap is really high, you know, like from 151 to your estimation, like 700-ish. And have you had a chance to look at why that was happening? And also maybe you can share a bit the methodology you used for that.
Yeah, that came out in the analysis. So what I was working from there was what's called all-cause mortality data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So they list deaths that come in from the States from all causes. Now, those causes aren't necessarily correctly identified, but it's what, you know, it's what's coming in on the death certificates. But they also list certain specific causes of death. And what I found was, so I found this very big and unexpected spike in Texas in the week of the winter storm. And I also found big and unexpected spikes in Washington and Oregon in late June, early July, which was during the heat wave. And those were, you know, several hundreds more than had been accounted for from this extreme weather. But I was able to look at the specific causes of death, and I was seeing spikes specifically for cardiovascular disease and for diabetes. So there's quite a strong literature that shows, particularly for cold, but also for extreme heat as well, that if you already have cardiovascular disease, you are extremely vulnerable. You are more vulnerable. Elderly people are more vulnerable. So, and this came out, you know, in the individual stories and in speaking with experts and looking at the scientific literature. Another problem with the cold in Texas is it's very difficult to, unless you arrive when somebody's still alive, it's very hard to tell whether somebody died from heart failure or hypothermia. Very, very difficult to tell post-mortem. So yeah, what was very clear was happening is that these deaths were being attributed to underlying conditions, particularly cardiovascular disease that the people already had. So they were quite sick already, but it was the cold that tipped them over the edge and killed them, or the heat up in Washington and Oregon.
Cool. Thank you, Peter. I would like to ask you a question, which I think very local in terms of topic. So climate change, of course, has been an issue here. And one of the exciting topic is about sea level rise in the country and the floods as well. So this is very simple and basic questions, but I think average journalist here needs to know, like, how can we access the data of sea level rise of some areas in Indonesia, for example, Jakarta, which is a lot of science reporter and also scientists predict it will be sinking in years, a decade or 2 decades. Like, how can we start those kind of reporting?
There are a number of good data sources. The two I used, if I remember correctly, in that graph I showed you in the climate data tracker, are there is a data set maintained by a research group at the University of Hawaii in the United States, but it's a global data set. It has data on gauges all around the world. And then the other one I used was an older data set from an analysis done in Australia by CSIRO, which is the main Australian research agency. So those were the two data sources I used. There's also satellite data. There's something called, I think, is it the TOPEX Poseidon mission, which is a NASA mission, which is doing satellite-based, what's called altimetry. So it's measuring the distance from the satellite to the sea surface by waves that have been down and bounced back up again. So there are various data sets. Some of them are in that NetCDF format that I talked about. Others are in different formats. Sometimes you have to download data for individual monitoring stations. But I'm afraid I'm not aware of what is being collected in Indonesia. But those data sets I mentioned are global in nature. Because one of the things about sea level rise, it doesn't happen at the same rate everywhere. It's not like a bathtub with the water going up. There are certain places where the sea level is rising quicker. I mean, I know around the Philippines is one. And there are certain places, like off the coast of Greenland, where because of the effects of melting ice and what the gravitational effects of that, sea level is actually dropping.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Let's go back to your presentation. You mentioned in the beginning about you calculate the temperature rise when the Glasgow meeting happened, and then there was the Paris goal, and then the pledge and target section, and then the other one is the current situation. Would you please walk through us a bit about the chart? Maybe you can share your specific chart as well, so people here know like what we are talking about.
Yeah, what do you want me to do? Shall I get back into
yeah, please, to the slides of the...
Yeah, and I think what I may need to do here is actually get into this story, right? This is...
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah, so what is it you want me to address?
How did you do that, and why was that happening?
Sorry, which chart are we referring to?
The temperature rise calculation, the Paris goal, and then the pledge and target.
The last chart.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is, so I rendered this chart, but this is not my analysis. This comes from the Climate Action Tracker, which I've just highlighted that link here. So you'll see a chart a little bit similar to this on their website, if you were to follow that link through from the story. I took the data, processed it a little bit, and made that data wrapper chart, but I can't claim any credit for the analysis there. It wasn't mine. Here I was reporting somebody else's analysis. So, but just to be clear on what that chart is showing here, this is a chart of emissions, and then the annotation shows the expected temperature increase, the maximum we'll get to over this time period, if that is the emissions trend. So current policies will put our trends in emissions into this zone. We anticipate that later in the century, that will lead to warming of up to 2.9 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. Where we want to be is in the green zone, which has, well, you can see that, this zone crosses zero. So that kind of assumes we've already got to a point where we're probably going to have to start taking some carbon down out of the atmosphere. This is called negative emissions technologies, to get to that goal of 1.5 degrees C. I mean, unfortunately, I do think this is an unrealistic goal now, and we're going to have to deal with a warmer world than that, and it's not going to be a pleasant thing, I'm afraid.
Okay. Peter, thank you. I would like to ask you to conclude and summarize this session, and maybe give advice to Indonesian journalists or journalists to be. Where do we start when we would like to cover climate change or environment stories like this?
So can I just ask a quick question? How much time do we have in total?
Oh, it's 1 to 2 minutes.
1 to 2 minutes. Okay. Well, firstly, my time management obviously wasn't that good. There is a separate section of my slides which I can share. I can pop them into the chat. That covers dealing with net CDF files and using this software called Panoply, which doesn't require you to be a coder. Like I do code in R and do most of my data analysis there. But Panoply software, I encourage you to look at it. It allows you to make visualizations of climate change from these net CDF files with no coding expertise. And I also have a NICAR presentation on that you can go and look at. But I think the big message to take home is, I would say, every story has a climate change element. Climate change is going to affect every single aspect of society, international relations, economics, social justice. There is always a climate change component. And I think one thing I would say is there is a lot of expertise out there. There are a lot of climate scientists who will explain to you what's going on. But I think the job of journalists is to take that knowledge and apply it to whatever beat you are working on, whatever story you are working on, whatever issue you are working on in your country, in your locality, in your city, because the way that the climate is changing, and particularly these extreme weather events, are going to affect everything. And I think that's the challenge. We need to turn climate journalism into all journalism, really. Or to put it another way, every journalist has to be a climate journalist, because if you're not, you're missing the defining phenomenon and story of our times, I think.
Oh, that's a really interesting takeaway, Peter. And thank you so much for joining this conference. We are really happy to have you here. And I need to end this session because we need to run to another session after this. So thank you so much. Good.
So yeah, thank you very much. And I'll make sure, well, actually, you already have my slides, so perhaps you can make sure they are shared with people afterwards.
Of course.
If you could share the Zoom link and everything with me, that'd be great.
Perfect. Yeah, will do. Thank you so much. Good morning and good evening, Peter. Bye-bye. Take care.